Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 11. Hendrik pored over his astrochart, making calculations on the edge of the paper and transferring the results to his notepad. He ripped out the page as Link entered. "Whiskey and water, sir?"
"No. I'll have one at the pub." Hendrik handed over the page of jottings. "Run these through the computer, will you? Usual program." He hesitated and frowned. "I hope I've got these calculations correct."
"You've never been wrong yet, sir." Hendrik looked at Link with distaste.
"I can't afford to be wrong."
He thought further and made some more calculations on his pad.
"When did we transmit last night?"
"Conjunction was at 20:33 hours, 42.75 seconds, sir." The astronomer compared his latest figures with this information and said,
"Then, if those figures make sense, tonight we'll start at..."
Link smiled reassuringly at his master and flourished the page of figures that he had been given. "I'll call you to dinner in good time, sir." Hendrik felt that in some way he was being patronized by his manservant. Link noticed his edginess and hurriedly said, "I'll run these right away, sir." They both left the room, taking their tensions with them. At the pub, Adam and Margaret stared gloomily into their drinks. The babble of inane twitter that passes for conversation at such a time was heavy enough to isolate them in their corner. Adam scowled even harder. Beginning. End. Circle. Always. A never-ending circle? Margaret waited. The lines around his eyes were from laughter years. Those around his mouth from the time of recent pain. It was those silly frown lines at the bridge of his nose she loved so much. Such concentration. "As far as I can make out," he said, "that's the beginning and the end." He smiled at his pathetic joke. "Well, it sounded genuine enough, Matthew's utterance. He certainly seems to have the gift, and that's what worries me." The frown returned. "I think he really did see Lyle through those gloves. I think he saw him drive away and stop at the edge of the circle. Next day, Lyle starts happy-daying all of us. The question is..." He sank into his scotch. "What happened to him in between?" Margaret wanted to believe so much the doctor's story, but he says he went to visit his patient 30 miles away. He says. And came back a different man? Adam shook his head. "Don't forget Kevin's changed too." "So whatever it was happened here," Margaret mused. "Inside the circle." There was little doubt that he was right, but the thought did nothing to lift their pocket of gloom. Across the bar, Adam caught sight of Hendrik paying for his drink. Seeing that Margaret was almost finished, Adam muttered, "Here's Hendrik. Drink up. I don't want to corner him until I've thought this through." They got almost to the door before the well-known voice greeted them. "Too late to buy you a drink?" The astronomer beamed at them both, charming and affable. Not wishing to seem churlish, Adam went through the good neighbor role of nodding and smiling and "Thanks, but no thanks, we're just going." But then his curiosity overcame his good sense, and he decided that there was a question that Hendrik could be tackled about. "That clay disc in the museum, the barber surgeon's amulet, What connection could that have with your supernova? Hendricks stared. The question had obviously come right out of the blue, and it seemed to confuse him. Adam gave him time, then said, Matthew thinks they are connected, but he can't figure out how. Does he now? Perceptible boy, that son of yours. Perceptive and formidable. A parry, Adam decided. It was certainly no answer of any sort. Hendricks' undoubted charm was a good deal more than skin deep, and Adam, despite himself, could not help liking the man, but the smile gave nothing away. Always supposing, he grudgingly conceded, that there was anything to give away. He found himself making goodbye noises and ushering Margaret out into the relative certainty of the gathering afternoon. The barrow was deserted, the entrance, just as they had left it. Almost 2 hours they waited there, hoping against hope that Di would, in some miraculous way, appear. Matthew knew that he was fooling himself with a dreamer's need, but it was difficult to accept the loss of Di. Sandra waited because Matthew waited, and because she could not understand the sequence of events that had led to Di's disappearance. Maybe the barrow, the ancient burial place, would provide an answer. The larks sang, but that was the only song they learned. On the way back along the avenue, they retraced their steps as nearly as possible. At the top of the earthwork, peering down into the ditch but not daring to approach the low, half-buried boulder that they could just make out, Matthew said, "He's never going back there. I know it now. He's never going back to the sanctuary." Sandra shivered. Was it only this morning that she had just last stood here? Then where is he? Gone. Matthew sounded savage. Not dead, just not here anymore. I felt that from the disc. He turned away. It's no good. I can't explain. At the cottage, Matthew cheered up considerably at the thought of food. He was in the midst of building a couple of his sandwich specials: mint jelly, apple crumble, mayonnaise, and ham, when Mrs. Crabtree appeared and tried to persuade him to eat properly, as she put it. She watched as Matthew constructed his desecration. It was her horror, as he added the onion and potato crisps to the mess, that prompted her to leave the kitchen saying, "You're not going to spoil Miss Sandra's appetite now, Mr. Matthew. She's going out to dinner tonight." The remark half registered with Matthew, although Sandra had no idea what the silly old hag was referring to. The real problem was a fried egg to top it off with, or just plain strawberries. It was only later that evening, when Adam and Matthew were giving Margaret and Sandra a pre-supper drink, that the remark echoed somewhere at the back of Matthew's consciousness. He repeated what Mrs. Crabtree had said. Margaret immediately started worrying about this new development. But how did she know? Hendrick hadn't even invited us then. Adam saw her concern and quickly grabbed the opportunity. Don't go. Tell him you changed your mind. Woman to the last. Margaret smiled and said, "But I'm longing to see the house." They all laughed, needing to loosen the tensions but aware of the realities. Adam kept on. Lyle said that Hendrick invited him to dinner, but he had to refuse because of an appointment with a patient 30 miles away. I don't believe he kept the appointment. So where did he go? Sandra stopped admiring her full-length dress for a moment. He can't have gone to Mr. Hendrick's, not if he wasn't expected. Wasn't he? Adam was laboring the point. If whatever happened to him happened in the village, it could have been at Hendrik's place. Margaret tried to laugh away his fears. It could have happened anywhere. Hendrik seems to be in charge, Adam insisted. People look up to him. I'm sure he knows what's going on. Margaret stood and prepared to leave. She looked beautiful in her long black dress. Young and exquisite. Then I'll be able to ask him, won't I? She pretended a confidence she was not too sure she had. Adam made her promise to come back to the cottage after she had finished dining with Hendrik. A nightcap, to reassure him that all was well. As Sandra rose from the Chesterfield, Matthew casually sneaked away a scarf that she had worn over her head when she arrived. Adam noticed his son tucking the small square of silk away under a cushion, but could not imagine what it was that Matthew was trying to achieve. When the girls were done, Adam demanded an explanation. Why on earth should Matthew want to steal Sandra's scarf? Matthew protested. I only borrowed it. It doesn't suit you. They both laughed. Then Matthew, rather self-consciously, for it was a far-out idea that he had, told his father, to use as a camera. Adam's face went through several changes of expression almost simultaneously. Admiration at his son's ingenuity. Delight at the thought that they would have some knowledge of what was happening at Highfield House. And worry at the thought of what Matthew was going to have to go through to achieve his object. Grudgingly, he said, Clever old you. Matthew grinned back reassuringly. Clever young me. The scarf was wound around Matthew's left fist rather tentatively. Adam said worriedly, Perhaps it should be held in your right hand. The left hand has always been associated with evil. Matthew shook his head. This is the hand I had Dr. Lyle's glove on. They both looked at each other, realizing that it was the evil they needed to know about, but neither liking to say so. The whole involvement was too frightening. Be careful, Matt. Hendrik watched Link fixing him a drink. He glanced at the digital clock on the mantel, and his mouth set. They're late. That's the one thing I didn't allow for. Plenty of time in hand, sir. Hendrik snorted. Women. Delightful creatures. But punctuality is not among their virtues. Link realized that his master was unduly nervous tonight. He hurried over with the glass set on a small silver salver. There is much, sir, to be said for a celibate life. The astronomer took the whiskey and stared at Link with a certain distaste. There was a sudden edge to the formality of their relationship. Hendrik tossed back the drink and replaced the glass on the salver. Tired, he looked older, and perhaps wiser than before. Very much the father figure. Yet I have my children. And the doorbell rang. Smoothly, Link said, The best of both worlds, sir. Hendrik immediately relaxed, unwound. Here are the new arrivals. I'll receive them. You make sure everything's on schedule. Link hurried away as Hendrik opened the great oak door. Framed in the doorway, looking small and delicate, against the iron and timber and stone, were Margaret and Sandra. The astronomer greeted them warmly and apologized for not having invited them to his house before. You know what a small village is. One has to observe the protocol. He was obviously trying his best to make them feel welcome and relaxed. Margaret and Sandra gazed about them appreciatively, and Hendrik smiled when Sandra glanced a second time at the timepiece on the mantel.
"It's a digital clock," he said. "Electronic."
"But what do you need it for? You've got dear old grandfather there."
"He's handsome, isn't he? Unfortunately, he doesn't keep such good time."
"Much more attractive, though," said Margaret. "Forgive me, but the other one looks so—" She shrugged, thinking she had gone too far, questioning the host's taste in clocks. Hendrick's smile broadened.
"Out of place?" he suggested. "It's just that I need absolute accuracy for my work. I still dabble. I need to be sure that everything is still where it should be at any given time."
Margaret suddenly saw something beyond the smile. She tried to see into his eyes, but the lids were hooding the truth of his expression. A small shiver of apprehension moved up her spine. Hendrick's voice grew softer, more caressing.
"The stars and the planets, the other places," he murmured.
"And your supernova," Sandra prompted, brightly. The astronomer beamed his brilliant smile at her.
"Especially my supernova," he crooned.
The whole house was suddenly silent. Matthew bent over his swathed hand, but felt nothing. The scarf had grown warm, almost moist. He began to lose concentration. Adam saw the slight change in attitude and anxiously demanded, "Well?" The boy raised his head and smiled. "Nothing yet. Nothing at all." Partly relieved and yet still fearful, Adam considered, "Perhaps she's not a suitable subject." "I don't think it's that," said Matthew. "I think anyone's a suitable subject as long as something's happening to them. Something important enough to make them very happy or very otherwise." "Yes." Matthew felt his mouth go acid. Adam stared at his son, still not sure that he should allow him to live through these experiences, but at the same time anxious to know just what was happening at the big house at the center of the circle. "Then let's hope you don't get a signal." "One thing puzzles me," said Margaret. She tried to make her voice sound more offhand, more casual. "Everyone around here seems to have caught the happy day bug, except you and Di. How do you explain that?" Hendrick was imperturbable. He took his time.
"I suppose he and I don't mix as much as the others. Haven't picked up the habit."
Habit. It's true that Di had never been part of the community in the proper sense, merely a peripheral figure, a raiding pirate on other people's property. The astronomer, too, could be classed in his role as a squire, only as a fairly gregarious hermit. But that was not the whole truth. People seem to use it as a code, a sign that they share some sort of secret, said Sandra.
"Aren't you being a little fanciful, my dear?" asked Hendrick. "It's a local custom. That's all."
Link arrived silently and announced dinner. Hendrick glanced at the clocks and rose from his armchair.
"Ready to go up, ladies?"
The girls glanced at each other in surprise. Margaret, rather taken aback, said, "Up?" The astronomer offered each of them an arm at the foot of the great staircase and said delightfully, "Up." Matthew glanced at Adam. Felt something then, sort of tremor. A pain, dull but aching, remained. What was it? Fear? Dunno. It's gone now. It had nearly gone. Just the memory of the agony lingered. False alarm. Adam felt drawn. The waiting had been nerve-wracking for him as much as for Matthew. Could be. It was like I felt when Bob wasn't run over by that disappearing truck. They grinned, but the worry hung on. What an extraordinary room. Margaret and Sandra stared about them in wonder. Hendrik had ushered them into a huge circular area at the top of the house, unplastered stone walls and a great decorated dome above them. The room looked like an uncompleted observatory or camera obscura. In the center of the space was a round stone table that appeared to be gently dished toward the center, surrounded by immovable stone seats. In a principal place there was an imposing, high-backed seat, ornately carved from a single block of stone. A splendid folly of a room. Behind them, above the door, another digital clock. Link, bringing up the rear, noted the figures as they flicked to 20, 40, 00. Exact time. Exactly on time. Not so extraordinary when you consider where we are. Hendrik waved them to their places. Not many have the fortune to live within a stone circle. I wanted the room to reflect this unique environment of ours. Link opened the door in the wall, but there was no room beyond. The shallow space revealed a kitchen lift, and up from below came a heated trolley containing plates and dishes of the food. The manservant wheeled the trolley to a side table, aware of the effect that his conjuring trick was having on the guests. Margaret smiled at him. This was a fascinating house. As Hendrik took his place at the table, Sandra said, "Is that a throne?" The astronomer dipped an exploratory spoon into his soup. "Found it in a mason's yard," he said. "Magnificent, isn't it?" "And these other pieces, the table and chairs, you had them made?" "The mason carved them in the same style, from the same stone." Margaret's curiosity was raising ahead of her meal. "Does he do restoration work?" she asked. "I'm always getting inquiries at the museum." Hendrik shook his head, laughing as though at some private joke. "Afraid not. He went out of business. Ages ago." He raised his glass to both of them in turn and said, "Bon appetit, my children." As they responded, Margaret smiled at Hendrik's avuncular mode. My children, indeed. So patronizing. Adam came from the kitchen with a laden tray. "Egg and chips, do you, Mr. Psychometrist?" Fantastic. Matthew had been sitting concentrating on Sandra's scarf, which was still wrapped tightly around his left fist. He started to eat one-handed. "Still quiet out there?" Adam sat at the table. "No tomato ketchup." "Sorry, sir. Coming right up, sir." Adam sprang to his feet and headed back into the kitchen. Matthew glanced sharply at the scarf. "Dad? Something's beginning to happen. I can feel it." The stab of pain, of the knife, of sound, slid sweetly into Matthew's mind. The sound shrilled into light. Adam hit the record button on the tape machine, which he had standing by on the table, and hurriedly pushed the microphone on its stand closer to his son, moving the plate of food to one side. "Can you see where they are? High. High at the top of the house." Adam puzzled. "A dining room at the top of the house. Are you sure?" Matthew's eyes were open, but his eyeballs were rolling upwards, only the whites showing. Sweat beaded his brow, and the words forced themselves out through the clenched teeth of apparent pain. There's a digital clock. It's important. It means something. Adam waited. Then, who's there? The girls. Hendrik. And another, a butler. What are they doing? Matthew fought away the circles of darkness that threatened his vision. Eating. Just eating, but Sandra's getting nervous. The sound of the ancient chant penetrated the stone walls of the house and wormed its way into the room at the top of the house. The rhythms were soft and low, but insistent. Sandra listened hard, trying to catch at the meaning. What's that? Hendrik stopped eating and listened. He half shrugged and went back to his food. Villagers. Rather unusual, don't you think? A hymn of celebration. Interested by this curious use of the word under the circumstances, Margaret asked, Celebration. What are they celebrating? Hendrik's face was shut. He expressed no feeling, no emotions at all. As he said, quite seriously, deliverance from the past. Their entry into the future. Now. The effect of his words was terrifying. The blandness of the astronomer's delivery, together with the import of his simple statement and the growing menace of the chant, somehow conveyed a horror that could not exist. Sandra felt cold creep over her. Suddenly it was difficult to breathe. Link removed the dish from in front of her, and the spell was broken as he knocked over an empty wine glass. Sandra grabbed at it, but it was faster than her reflex and rolled down the dished stone into the very center of the table, out of reach. The host smiled from his throne. Clumsy shape for a table, isn't it? He said evenly. Still troubled by the astronomer's explanation of the chant, Margaret muttered in agreement. And so it would be, if that were its only function. Hendrik paused for effect. Did you know that there was another great dish of stone beneath the ground here? Margaret nodded. Adam Brake told me that. Hendrik showed surprise momentarily. Did he? Did he also tell you that my house is at the center of the circle? Sandra chipped in almost proudly. Matthew worked that out. He's very clever at working things out. Hendrik smiled at her slowly and very softly said, So I've noticed. I still don't see the connection. Margaret cut across the thread. The table and the circle. He half rose and reached into the center of the table to retrieve the wine glass. Perhaps it is not necessary for you to understand. It is only necessary that you should believe me when I tell you that it all works toward good. He paused and smiled fondly at Margaret. Happiness and peace are the reward of the believer. Margaret shrank back into her seat, fear welling up in her. She reached out and took Sandra's hand. You make it sound as if the circle was a temple, and the table an altar. Sandra hung on tight. Your temple, your altar. Link coughed discreetly and left the room, closing the door behind him. Hendrik glanced at the digital clock above the closing door and smiled happily at the guests. Bowing his head, he chanted in time with the sound from outside the house. Anger of fire, fire of speech, breath of knowledge, render us free from harm. Return to us the innocence that once we knew. Complete the circle. Make us at one with nature and the elements. He looked up into the dome of the room. A section of the ceiling rolled back silently to reveal the night sky. Hendrik raised his hands and covered his face as he declaimed, "It is time." His throne revolved so that he was left facing the wall, the high back of the seat forming a shield between him and the table. As Margaret and Sandra stared at each other, frozen in terror, unable to move, a shaft of brilliant light rose from the center of the table and shot through the hole in the dome into the night. The last thing that the girls knew was the shrilling of the stars and the wind of space as they were irradiated in the glow of the power conjured by their host.